Did you notice that foreign policy was not even mentioned in this week's presidential debate? Join Richard Ebeling and me and special guest Ted Galen Carpenter in this week's segment of the Libertarian Angle as we discuss U.S. foreign policy. Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's issue of the Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you the principled case for libertarianism. And I'm joined, as I am every week, by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, professor of economics at the Citadel. Richard, good to see you again for another round of Libertarian Angle.
It's great to be with you and our viewers and listeners, and our very special guest this week.
Yeah, we got a special guest, Ted Galen Carpenter, one of my real-life heroes in the libertarian movement. Ted is Senior Fellow in Defense and Foreign Policy Studies at the Cato Institute, written many books on foreign policy. I think probably is the premier foreign policy expert in the libertarian movement. Ted, it's an honor to have you here on the show.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me, and it's an honor to be on your show.
Well, thank you. You know, we know that with all the hubbub with the pandemic and all the chaos and crisis going on, that foreign policy still is, if not the burning issue of our time, certainly one of the top burning issues of our time. We're dealing with an issue that involves death, destruction, the destruction of our liberties, and you've written just volumes on this subject. Can you kind of give us a synopsis of where you think we are in America, where we've come from, what our roots are, and where we need to go to get this country back on the right track?
Well, I think indicative of the problem we're facing now is the total lack of attention in the presidential debate between Joe Biden and Donald Trump. Foreign policy, defense policy, was not even a topic that they were supposed to discuss. A few stray items leaked in during the discussion, but there was no focus on it. And yet this is crucial. U.S. foreign policy has caused destruction around the world, created millions of refugees, hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians being killed. The American people are burdened with excessive taxation, in part because of trying to fund Washington's global empire. These things need to be discussed. They need to be completely examined, reconsidered. We have lost our way in trying to be a republic of liberty. We are now an imperial power, and one that is causing tremendous destruction around the world.
Well, let me sort of pick up on that, Ted, in the following way. Usually the case is made that, especially since the end of the Second World War, the United States has had to have this mantle of global leadership. Otherwise, other rivalrous powers would rise to preeminent position, threaten the stability, the freedom, the independence of many other parts of the world. Someone that needs to be a voice for democracy. And you're running counter to that. And I think that it's important to articulate the reasons why it is both unnecessary and detrimental for America to play this kind of role. And perhaps you could offer your perspective on that.
The need to exercise global leadership has been the main justification given for the kind of role the U.S. has played since World War II. And at the beginning, there was at least a plausible case for that because the international system had been shattered because of the destruction in World War II. The Soviet Union appeared to be a truly menacing global power. We know now that its power was substantially overrated, but that wasn't obvious at the time. However, the United States persisted in trying to dominate world affairs long after other major countries had revived or had arisen and could have been being able to exercise a balance of power against the Soviet Union or any other would-be predator. And although the United States always portrayed itself as the champion of democracy, the protector of freedom, if you look at the actual record, the United States crawled into bed with every manner of slimy dictatorship around the world, as long as that dictatorship professed to be anti-Soviet, anti-communist. So we became, unfortunately, a caricature of an imperial power that was not based on any moral principles anymore at all. It was simply an exercise in power, alliances with any other country that was willing to help protect and advance that power. And the consequences for the rest of the world were extremely unfortunate. And the consequences for the American people, the loss of liberty in this country, the tremendous financial burden, that has been horribly destructive.
Well, if I could look at this a bit more, I want to play devil's advocate here, because there are people who might be watching or listening to this who are sympathetic towards a classical liberal libertarian argument, but it's so much pushed the other way that I sort of want to draw you out a little bit more, if I may. Let's take the situation now in Asia. China is a huge political and economic player in the globe. It seems to be undertaking what many analysts say a far more aggressive stance. There's been verbal threats to invade Taiwan. They have been creating these artificial islands in the South China Sea, prodding into international waters of surrounding countries in the South China Sea that international agreements recognize as belonging to the Philippines or Vietnam or something. They have been attempting to establish military leases and bases de facto in Djibouti, in the Horn of Africa. They've manipulated these types of arrangements in Sri Lanka. They seem to be playing an imperial power and an ideology that certainly is not conducive to limited government or individual freedom, and obviously that's an understatement. So many conservatives and some libertarians might wonder, well, if America withdraws from the world to a much more limited, merely self-defense posture, then what happens when an aggressive nation with the political and increasingly economic clout, and therefore the capacity to build up a large military presence, what happens when we withdraw and that country becomes increasingly a danger to other countries and eventually perhaps even the US itself? So what is the response to that perspective?
One of the responses we're already seeing as China's behavior becomes more abrasive, more intrusive, it's jeopardizing the interests of a lot of other countries. We're already seeing strategic dialogue, for example, between India and Japan, because both of them are worried about Beijing's expansionism, its increasingly assertive role. If China continues to behave the way it has been under the leadership of the Communist Party, Beijing may find itself with very few friends anywhere in the world and virtually no friends at all in its immediate neighborhood, because every other country feels threatened by China's ambitions. So the United States simply needs to stand back and let the normal balancing process in the international community take place. We, if anything, have retarded that process by putting American power on the front lines at great risk to the United States. The last thing I think any American should want is a war between China and the United States. And yet we are shielding Taiwan, South Korea, Japan, the Philippines, numerous other countries. And they are holding back, trying to preserve at least a decent relationship with China and put the United States out front as their protector while they conduct trade relations and other normal relations with Beijing. So our policy ends up being a lot of risk and not that much in the way of benefit.
You made a good point, Ted, about the debate last night, that they didn't even talk about it or mention it. I think the basic reason is because Democrats and Republicans, conservatives and progressives, they all agree on the foreign policy interventionist paradigm and the national security state paradigm. They may argue over whether the intervention should take place in this country or whether it's too soon to bring troops out of Afghanistan after, umpteen decades, or Iraq or whatever. But there's really no fundamental difference between Biden and Trump on foreign interventionism. Trump has paid lip service to non-interventionism, but look, after 3.5 years or so, he hasn't ended any of the endless wars, and he's threatened to start new ones with Iran and Venezuela and so forth. I think it's important, hearing you talk about the non-interventionist ideas to talk a little bit about the founding foreign policy of America. And my favorite way to do that is John Quincy's 4th of July address to the Congress in 1821. It's called In Search of Monsters to Destroy, where he said, look, there are a lot of bad things that happen in the world. There's invasions, there's aggressors, there's tyrants, there's famines, there's oppression. But the U.S. is not going to send troops abroad in search of these monsters to destroy. Instead, we're going to be trying to devote our efforts to establishing a free society here, serve as a haven for people suffering oppression or starvation overseas, and that's the best contribution that America could ever make to the world. Now, all that changed, it seems to me, with the Spanish-American War, the World War I, World War II, and then the conversion of the federal government to a national security state after World War II. And so we go through the whole Cold War, but then what happens after the Cold War? Doesn't look like anything fundamentally changes. The national security state governmental apparatus stays, which I hold is the exact opposite of a limited government republic, which is a type of government that America got founded on. And then you've got the interventions that go into the Middle East, the Persian Gulf War, the sanctions against Iraq that were killing multitudes of Iraqi children. Madeleine Albright's infamous statement that the deaths of 500,000 Iraqi children from the sanctions were worth it. The stationing of troops near Islamic Holy Lands, the unconditional support to the Israeli government, the no-fly zones. I mean, all of this, what people said, we said. Chalmers Johnson, the former CIA analyst, wrote a book called Blowback, saying this is going to produce terrorist blowback. And it did, with 9/11, and then before that, the 1993 attack on the World Trade Center, the attacks on the embassies in East Africa. So we end up with this now endless war on terrorism, which is really better than the Cold War as far as Iraq goes, as far as I'm concerned, because the more people they go over there to kill with terrorism, in terms of what they supposedly are, terrorists, the more people get angry and the more terrorists there are. So how do you get out of this whole syndrome?
One of the first books I published after the end of the Cold War had the title A Search for Enemies, which explains why the United States military establishment, the military industrial complex, the whole network of vested interests that had grown up during World War II and the Cold War desperately needed a new enemy once the Soviet Union collapsed to justify its existence, its budgets, its power. And that's what we've seen over the past 3 decades, this search for enemies to find new reasons for U.S. intervention around the world. Now, that has taken various forms, the war on terror being the all-purpose excuse. But there's also been the so-called responsibility to protect, to intervene around the world where there are massive human rights violations. Well, these become blank checks for endless US intervention. And what we've seen is that Washington's actions, far more often than not, have made bad situations even worse. Examples of that include Iraq, obviously, given the overthrow of Saddam Hussein. Iraq has been terribly unstable and violent ever since. Libya perhaps being an even clearer example, where the United States led its NATO alliance into overthrowing Muammar Gaddafi, the longtime dictator of Libya. Now, Gaddafi was a bad guy, to be sure, but you didn't have open air slave markets in Libya under Muammar Gaddafi. You do now. You didn't have hundreds of thousands of refugees, both people who were internally displaced and tens of thousands trying to flee across the Mediterranean to some kind of sanctuary in Europe, many of them drowning in the process because they're going across on flimsy, overcrowded boats. And that's the kind of thing US intervention has caused, whatever the intentions. And I think there's always a mixture of intentions where you get some people who are true believers in the humanitarian agenda, thinking that US intervention will make things better, will overthrow brutal tyrants, and create the possible conditions for democracy. They're delusional for the most part, but I think the beliefs are at least sincerely held. But then you have the vested interests, that military industrial intelligence complex that has grown up over the last 70 some years. And most of those people know exactly what they're doing. They're profiting handsomely from this, both in terms of careers, prestige, and of course, financially. So we have that convergence of motives, but what we get then is this bipartisan enthusiasm for the US to be not just the global policeman, but the global armed social worker. And that's the situation we're facing today.
Richard?
What I'd like to do to, if you could, the concrete again, because these are the things that are thrown at critics of foreign interventionism. Well, what if China decides to invade Taiwan? Are we to stand by and not support a people who we have been in an informal alliance with since 1949, when Chiang's government withdrew to Taiwan, having lost the mainland to Mao? What if Russia were to threaten the Baltic republics? Do we not have obligations under NATO? We're just to now throw these obligations away when other countries have become dependent upon us and have designed their own attitudes towards other countries based upon an assumption of collective security. So how does one untangle this, and what does one do when other nations threaten other parts of the world?
I think the first part of that is at least to change the declaratory policies, to emphasize to the NATO allies that we are going to withdraw from the North Atlantic Treaty, that we're going to transfer responsibility for Europe's security to the Europeans, probably through the European Union, but European countries may create their own defense arrangements specifically tailored to the needs of Europe. Much the same thing with East Asia. I believe the United States should have had a heart-to-heart with Taiwanese leaders several years ago, saying it was one thing for the US to offer this implicit security guarantee when China was weak, when China could not pose a serious danger militarily to the United States. China now has the ability to strike the American homeland and do so with nuclear weapons. The risk level to the United States is massively greater than it was even a couple decades ago. And we have to face reality that if China moves against Taiwan And Chinese leaders, and I think many many people in China, ordinary people, believe that Taiwan is rightfully part of China. If they act on that belief and use military force against Taiwan, are we prepared to wage a full-scale war against China, knowing the enormous destruction that that's almost certain to cause to the United States? This policy seems like a bluff, and a very, very dangerous bluff. If it is called, then what are the policy choices? We then back away from a solemn commitment and say, well, we were kidding. We were never serious. You really shouldn't have believed us. Well, that certainly doesn't help our national reputation. But it might well be worse, probably would be worse, to try to honor the commitment, because that would mean a full-scale war against China, and one that the United States is not certain of winning. In fact, the odds are growing that if we have a showdown with China, unless we are prepared to escalate to the nuclear level, the United States is likely to lose an air and naval war in the extreme Western Pacific. We would be fighting right in China's front yard, if not on China's front porch. That puts America's military capabilities at an extreme disadvantage.
I think another point that we should keep in mind is the ability of everyday Americans to go to the assistance of foreign regimes that are under threat by other regimes. Americans did that during the Spanish-American War. But the probability is that most Americans, I would say 99% of Americans would say, well, as much as we sympathize with the Balkan countries or Taiwan, it's not enough for us to give up our lives, our everyday lives here in America in order to go overseas to fight. But they certainly should be free to do that. And the point you bring up about endless enemies is very good, Ted. That to me is really the coin of the national security state, of every national security state, that they need official enemies. And in the Cold War, it was the Soviet Union or godless communism or Red China, the so-called communist threat. John Kennedy, I think, came to the realization that this was all just a crock. That was his famous peace speech at American University, where he said, look, the Cold War is over. We're going to have peaceful and friendly coexistence, which was anathema to those that needed the official enemy. And then after the Cold War was over, I think that shocked a lot of people in the national security establishment, because they expected the Cold War to go on forever. And that was when they needed new official enemies. And I think that's where the interventionism comes in. Now the terrorists now become the new official enemy, which become endless. And now that the war on terrorism looks to be dwindling, because they're feeling this pressure to get out of the Middle East and out of Afghanistan, which would disintegrate the terrorist blowback threat, all of a sudden, coincidentally, China's now an official enemy, and they use this imperialist lingo like assertive, aggressive, adversary, rival, all the standard imperialist stuff, along with Russia. You see, now Russia's resurfacing. They don't use the communist threat anymore, but it's the same mindset. We need these official enemies. And I think your other point about how the hypocrisy in all this, that they've not only aligned themselves with dictatorial regimes like Saudi Arabia, Egypt, they've also installed dictatorial regimes. They've actually destroyed democratic regimes like in Guatemala or Chile in order to install dictatorial regimes. So this whole policy of foreign interventionism and a national security state is riddled with crookedness and corruption, profiteering, not to mention the destruction of our own liberties here at home.
Yeah, there's no question about that. I mean, one of the first measures that was adopted after the 9/11 attacks was the so-called Patriot Act that greatly expanded the surveillance state in the United States and gave powers to the intelligence agencies, to the FBI, to a variety of other agencies that certain leaders in those bodies had been seeking, in some cases, for decades. They now had the perfect justification or pretext for getting those powers. The powers were granted by Congress with virtually no debate. And we have seen where it has led. Mass surveillance with government officials flat out lying to the American people that this was taking place. The reason that US officials have been so angry at individuals like Julian Assange and Edward Snowden is that those people revealed what the national security bureaucracy was up to and how often that bureaucracy had lied to the American people. Nothing that Assange and Snowden revealed has been shown to be false. To this day, there is not a single example that the information, the leaks that they exposed, contained false information. So these people are hardly traitors to America. They should be regarded as national heroes. They have exposed what the national security state has been up to. And what they've revealed is shockingly ugly and dangerous.
Now, Ted, I'm playing the role here, devil's advocate, because I think it's important because there are people who have these questions. Let us suppose that the United States was to follow a foreign policy much more limited than its current one, much more closer or consistent with this classical liberal idea of non-interventionism for interventionism's sake. What in that environment is a rationale for or a criticism of any form of collective security? Are there instances where it is useful or desirable, even for a classical liberal society, to participate in international defensive alliances? And if so, how far should they be viewed as stretching out beyond the territories of the United States itself?
Well, even George Washington emphasized that temporary alliances for extraordinary emergencies were justified, that America from time to time might need to make an alliance with another power or powers to deal with a very serious threat. But the emphasis was on temporary and something for a specific purpose, not an endless alliance for all manner of objectives. And that's what we have drifted into over the past 7 decades or so, where we're creating alliances with all manner of countries, even when the overall purposes are not clear, and where the connection to genuine American security interests are weak to non-existent. All that does is needlessly entangle us in the quarrels of other countries and other regions, increasing the danger to the American people, not providing benefits to the American people, just providing more and more and more risks and costs. And that's what we see now. Doesn't mean that if a lethal threat arose in the international system, that the United States could not make temporary arrangements, temporary alliances with other like-minded powers that also felt threatened. But that kind of alliance has to come to an end when that particular threat, that particular danger fades or disappears. I think one of the most unfortunate aspects, but was typical given what has happened, was when the Soviet Union disintegrated. This was the great enemy that justified NATO and virtually all other U.S. alliances. Now, one would think at that point, following Washington's advice, we should have said, well, NATO deserves a nice retirement party. It seemed to have accomplished its purpose of containing Soviet power, possible Soviet aggression. That adversary, that enemy, no longer exists. Instead, there was this desperate search for alternate missions to justify NATO's continued existence. Even worse, what we found was a conscious effort to expand NATO, to push it right up to the borders of a newly democratic Russia, something that any Russian government was going to find extremely threatening. So we're now in a new Cold War with at least a quasi-democratic Russia, and one in which the United States and its Western allies provoked. The United States and its NATO allies are the ones who started the new Cold War. Russia did not. Russia reacted defensively to some extremely provocative actions.
Yeah, I think your point is very well taken, especially since they kind of implied that NATO certainly would not expand when the Soviet Union came crashing down, but expand it did. It ends up absorbing all the Warsaw Pact nations and works its way all the way up to Ukraine, which of course is on the border of the Soviet Union. So you can understand why the Russia would be miffed over this. Your point about Snowden and Assange is very good too. I also believe that they're heroic and that they're tremendous patriots and courageous for what they've done. And it's not just the surveillance, as you know, Ted. There's also the out of control spending on the military industrial complex. I mean, many years ago, I was at a Cato function. One of Ed Crane, who was former president of Cato, one of the founders, he had those salmon fests at his house annually. And I was there, and I don't remember who it was, but somebody came up to me and said, "What do you consider the greatest threat to our freedom?" And this was long before 9/11. And I didn't hesitate. I said the warfare state. I mean, there's just no question. As bad as the welfare state is, it pales to insignificance compared to the warfare state. And we ended up seeing this not only with the surveillance, but the power of assassination. I mean, they've got the power to assassinate Americans now, upheld by the Supreme Court, as long as they related to national security or terrorism. They've got Guantanamo, where they can take people, deny them due process of law, trial by jury. I mean, it's indefinite detention. It's an incredible abrogation of civil liberties. And that's what the warfare state has done to us.
Absolutely right. And again, this was built in stages. We saw with George W. Bush's administration the assertion that the United States had the right to imprison people without trial, as long as the allegation was that they were involved in terrorism. Well, Barack Obama escalated that, ratcheted that up another notch, that the US government has the right to assassinate American citizens if the government charges that those individuals are involved in terrorism. One of the people that the Obama administration assassinated was the 16-year-old son of Anwar al-Awlaki, who very likely was involved in terrorism. But his son, there is no evidence at all that he was ever engaged in terrorist activities. When confronted with this, President Obama said, well, he had a bad father. He should have had a better father. I mean, what a shockingly insensitive comment. What a shockingly arrogant comment. And yet, that's the kind of attitude that we find among US leaders today. I have little doubt that if there was another massive terrorist incident akin to 9/11, we would see manifestations of a police state that would make anything we've seen to this point look rather mild by comparison.
Yeah. We seem to have lost Richard again, and let me see if I can get him back on. I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, I think that the times in which we're living are very precarious because all they need is one great big crisis, and they're going to come crashing down, and they've got it all set up. I mean, okay, they may have been convinced that Anwar al-Awlaki was involved in terrorism. He very well may have been, but the founders made it very clear that you don't kill people without due process of law. And terrorism is a criminal offense. It's in the U.S. Code as a criminal offense. That's why there's terrorism prosecutions in federal court. And once you start saying that the government's got the power to take citizens out because they're convinced or because they suspect that they're terrorists, then there's really no control at all. The constitutional prohibition against taking of life without due process of law goes right outside the window. And I agree with you that all you need is one more big crisis, and everything could come crashing down in terms of a police state, especially when you combine the economic crisis along with the health crisis, the pandemic, and then a foreign policy crisis. It could get pretty bad for us here.
Indeed. Again, we've seen the erosion of the Fourth Amendment against unreasonable searches and seizures become so diluted that it is almost meaningless today. We're about to see, and I think we've already seen, major erosions of the due process clause in the Fifth Amendment. And we're already seeing restraints on the First Amendment, on freedom of speech. So our global empire is coming at a tremendous cost, and not just financially to the American people. It's coming in the way of tremendous cost with the erosion of fundamental constitutional rights.
Okay, on that eloquent note, Richard, are you still with us?
Yes, I am.
Would you like to wrap things up here?
Yeah, I would just like to say is that as Jacob was suggesting, there's a two-headed monster that is strangling the United States. One is the domestic welfare state, and the other is the foreign policy interventionist warfare state. The difficulty for the American people is to understand the dangers of both of them, and especially the foreign policy one, and to be able to extract ourselves from this in some way through what will have to be a political decision. Our tragedy right now is that, was we said it early on, we have two presidential candidates, both of whom at their most fundamental level believe in the duty and the responsibility of the United States government to play policeman of the world. They may differ how it should do it, where it should do it, with what magnitude and with what allies and with what selected enemies. But the underlying presumption is that America must play this imperial role. And it not only brings death and destruction, as Jacob was saying, abroad, but as you were highlighting too, Ted, its ultimate danger is the loss of liberty and privacy and the wealth of the Americans. It's the demise of a free society at home in the name of supposedly fighting for freedom abroad.
Very well put.
Yeah, and I think that's why our work is more important than ever. I mean, there's a lot of darkness under which we're living, but there's a light shining through that darkness, and it's light provided by people such as yourself, Ted, that has written these fantastic books. Is there any one of your books that you would recommend people start with?
I would recommend probably, although it's a very long read, Perilous Partners, which documents Washington's intimate associations with some of the foulest regimes in the world, even when the United States was portraying itself as the leader of the free world. For a book on a more limited topic, I have one on NATO, my most recent book, NATO, the Dangerous Dinosaur, which documents just how the original purpose of NATO has been totally transformed to justify a continuing U.S. imperial role in Europe, again, at great cost and danger to the American people.
Yeah, and then there's all your volumes of articles there at the Cato Institute's website at cato.org. We link to just about everything you write in our FFF Daily. So thank you so much, Ted, for coming on the show and providing some more light to our fellow Americans as to how do we get out of this morass, and that's with a libertarian foreign policy. Richard, as always, greatly enjoyed the visit and look forward to talking to you next week.
Until next week, and thank you very much, Ted.
Thank you very much for inviting me.